name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kalima Horra, and my audience does too. Kalima Horra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to this special edition of Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, as part of Al Mayadeen's in-depth coverage of the events in the Ukraine, which have, of course, changed everything. The tectonic plates have shifted, and we're asking the question, after that dust has settled, though there's much dust yet to be spilled, how did the world react to the Ukraine conflict? Well, the first point that needs to be made is it depends what you mean by the world. Usually people mean the Western world. The West is 10% of the population of the actual world. And if, as I hypothesize, a new Eurasia begins to solidify out of this conflict, the West will actually be the periphery of the globe. But the West has big media and political power still in the world. So if you were to say how the world reacted, well, the Western world reacted with vehemence, perhaps premeditated vehemence, and in more or less lockstep unity. The governments like Germany and France that had earlier seemed reluctant to confront Russia on behalf of the United States finally threw their lot in with Joe Biden. They went gung-ho for the war. And public opinion, it has to be considered, as a dissident myself, that overwhelmingly public opinion was on the side of their own governments, helped by the systematic elimination of contrary points of view and the supercharged, turbocharged promotion of state narratives. Our football clubs were taken over as celebrations of Ukraine. There were restaurants in London demanding proof of support for Ukraine before their patrons would be allowed in to dine there. I'm not making that up. On social media, which is a very significant difference from, say, the Iraq War in 2003, when someone like me felt particularly hunted and was regularly abused, sometimes attacked as a dissident. This is much, much worse, because now we have the amplifier of social media, which amplifies the official media's point of view. But the rest of the world, of course, was rather different. China remained steadfast in its strategic partnership with Russia, and China will, I think, in the end, be the major beneficiary of the great rupture, the great uncoupling that is now underway between the West and what will become that new Eurasian future. But India, interestingly, refused to go along with the anti-Russia jamboree. And that marked a significant turn of events also. Other countries at the UN level allowed themselves to be browbeaten, bullied, some of them bribed, into lining up behind the United States narrative on this subject. But their people, well, that was a different thing. In South Africa, for example, where Russia and its ally, Cuba, had been the principal mainstay of the liberation struggle to overthrow apartheid in the 1970s and 80s in particular, well, the people in South Africa were overwhelmingly behind Russia in the conflict, even if their government was not quite so clear about it. And elsewhere in Africa, China's call that we have never occupied an Arab country, and neither has Russia occupied another African country. We did not seize the people of Africa and take them away as slaves. There was never a Chinese Congo or a Russian Congo, but there was a Belgian Congo. So the NATO countries are marked forever in African consciousness as having been on the side of colonialism and the brute repression and grand larceny of their resources. So the answer to my question, how did the world react, depends where in the world you are and what part of the telescope, which end of the telescope you're looking through. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur here. I'm joined, as always, by a distinguished panel of experts. So let's hear how they saw how the world reacted to the Ukraine conflict. First up, China expert, very considerable China expert, Keith Bennett. Keith, thanks for joining us. Did I summarize the Chinese position properly?
Well, thanks very much, George. And I'm afraid that, as always, you've said just about everything that needs to be said on the subject. So really, I want to echo what you said. I mean, you're so right that when you sit in Britain and we having an absolute onslaught of anti-Russian hate and war propaganda, such that, Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky are subjects of bans. Now, whatever you think of Tchaikovsky or Dostoevsky, I don't think they can be held responsible for the actions of Mr. Putin. So you get this feeling, you get the impression is given that to have a policy that actually can see the Russian point of view is completely beyond the pale. Nobody is going to subscribe to it. But if you look at what's happened in the United Nations, for all that you can look at when it went to the General Assembly, certainly it's true that the majority of countries voted for an anti-Russian resolution, albeit one that they'd already had to water down considerably to get where they did. But the representatives of the majority of the world's population did not support that resolution. China and India, as you've mentioned, as well Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, none of these countries supported. 35 countries, including Russia, cast a negative vote in the General Assembly. 35 abstained. But as I say, they represent the majority of the world's population. If you look at those, then there was a country like Venezuela, which was not able to vote because its voting rights have been taken away because it can't pay its dues, membership dues to the UN. Why can't it do that? Because the Americans have sanctioned and blockaded them. But you have, 17 African countries abstained on the resolution, and one of them, Eritrea, voted against. And even when one looks at those who voted for the American resolution, the Canadian ambassador to the UN was tweeting during the debate saying, we're working the phones to make sure people vote for this resolution. So there's, as you say, a lot of arm twisting, a lot of blackmail, a lot of threats. So you have to put it also into that context. And I was talking to an Iraqi friend, a veteran Iraqi communist, and he told me that just in Iraq, literally everyone is supporting the Russians. And then he sent me a message later in the evening to show that that night, all across Baghdad, huge posters of Putin had gone up. And of course, Iraq was also one of the countries that didn't vote with the Americans. Because as you said, Russia, China have never colonized a Middle Eastern country, rather the contrary. So I think that it can be very isolating and dispiriting here in Britain, but we have to remember that those of us who are against this war propaganda and this anti-Russian hatred actually are standing on the same side as the majority of the people of the world.
That's a very powerful way of putting it. Ella Rule, you're the chairwoman of the Communist Party in Britain. The tectonic plates that I referred to are very definitely moving, aren't they? And you'll be well familiar with the old Chinese saw, Chairman Mao, I think, that sometimes the enemy struggles mightily to lift a huge stone only to drop it on its own feet. Do you think that's what's happened here?
Oh, in very, very many ways. I think what is going to happen, there's been a huge disruption in supply lines, and food all over the world is going to go up in price in countries where the vast masses of people are already suffering. Can you imagine when the food prices go up even more? And of course, fuel is going to be so much more expensive, which means that transport is going to be expensive, and this is going to create a massive hike in prices. And in the poor countries, I think they're just mobilising for revolution. But I mean, even in Britain, ordinary British households can expect, we're told, energy bills of £360 a month, in addition to having much more expensive food in the supermarkets and everything else. How can people not be furious, and how can they not turn to, at very least, mayhem and hopefully to revolution, because this system is something that is untenable. It can't be allowed to carry on.
Gas in Britain on this day last year was 44 pence per therm. Today it is 796 pence. So the tripling of gas prices is about to triple and perhaps triple again. Mark Wadsworth, you are a veteran campaigner on the left for racial justice. You're the leader of grassroots Black Left. You are well in touch with your Africanness, though born and bred, of course, in Britain. This figure that Keith Bennett gave of mass abstention in Africa and the phenomenon I described of South Africa, where they can see things very clearly indeed. There were posters of Putin all over Baghdad. There were posters of Putin all over the townships in South Africa also. This is another of the great divides which has opened up, isn't it?
As a person of colour, representing the majority of the world, as we heard from Keith, there is definitely a divide. I mean, you only have to switch on your television now that social media, and that's an example where it has worked, has shown horrifying images of black students, of students from India, from different parts of Asia, being forced away from getting onto trains to escape. They were studying in the Ukraine, pushed aside because they are the wrong colour as far as the Ukrainian authorities are concerned. And as a journalist of many decades, I am appalled that my colleagues have abandoned objective, impartial journalism for pure state propaganda. That's what we're seeing at the moment.
And you must be more even aware than I am of the gigantic difference in official and public attitudes to refugees coming from the Ukraine compared to refugees coming through the Libyan Gap from other wars in the Middle East and North Africa.
Absolutely. And I want to read a quote. And this is a BBC correspondent talking to a former Ukraine deputy general prosecutor, where he said that it appalled him seeing these fleeing white people as refugees from the conflict. He said, "It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed." What does the BBC presenter say? "I understand and, of course, respect the emotion." Meanwhile, on Britain's ITV, a correspondent in Poland said, "This is not a developing third world nation, this is Europe." So you
civilized.
See, civilized Europe. So if you're a Yemeni, where there's been a war prosecuted by Saudi Arabia, the American ally, for 7 years, and 4 million refugees, and thousands of deaths, you don't count. If you try and cross the channel, the English Channel, into Britain, you are an illegal immigrant.
The Royal Navy will turn you back powerful indeed. Let's hear, though, from a conservative voice, conservative journalist and commentator, Andre Walker, who actually is on the Poland-Ukraine border. Andre, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot.
What has happened, even in 2014, as a result of the coup in Kiev, when Crimea decided that its future lay with Russia? Of course, there were sanctions and so on. There was nothing like this escalation. What has changed?
Well, before I was a journalist, I was involved in conservative politics, and I'm somebody who campaigned incredibly hard against Britain's membership of the European Union. And I've never particularly thought that after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO was relevant. The issue, though, as far as I'm concerned, is the response of Vladimir Putin. It is not appropriate to violate a sovereign nation. It is not appropriate to send your tanks in. It is not appropriate to drop cluster bombs. And so I think we need to remember that whilst I don't support Ukraine's membership of the European Union, because I don't support anybody's membership of the European Union, I don't think it's appropriate when people say that we're parking our tanks on Vladimir Putin's lawn. I don't think Vladimir Putin has the right to violate an independent country. And I believe that Ukraine has the right to join the European Union and NATO, should they so wish to do. It is, of course, something that I will campaign strongly against. And I think that we are seeing something that's really telling, in that even ethnic Russians in Ukraine are extremely opposed to this. Not because they don't want to be part of Russia, not because they dislike their Russian neighbors and friends and family, but because the way that this has been achieved, the idea that you're going to send in forces to kill people, I think is wholly inappropriate. I think there were better ways for Russia to do this. And I think that this just talks to the fact that Vladimir Putin is not pushing forward the needs of the Russians. Far too many times he's interested in his hand in the till. Far too many times he's interested in misappropriating assets. And far too many times he's willing to send young Russian men in to die fighting really their own cousins. It's not acceptable.
But Russia has been saying for the last 8 years that it could not tolerate a Ukraine that might join NATO and move US military hardware, including potentially nuclear hardware, to a few minutes flying time from Russia. Ukraine was openly saying it wanted to join NATO, and even latterly that it wanted to arm itself with nuclear weapons. How did all that come about?
Well, George, something that you're not going to like at all. I think that Ukraine is a country that had been badly bullied and abused during the Soviet period. And I think actually what people forget is, yes, there are historical ties with Russia and multiple countries, but the behavior of the Kremlin during the Soviet period has really ruined many of those relationships. And the reality is that, Ukraine doesn't love the European Union, Ukraine doesn't love NATO, but what they do dislike very strongly is the Kremlin, and they distrust leadership from Russia. Now, I think that's going to take a lot of time to get over, and I think it's made significantly worse by an invasion. And I think that if we were to say that the European Union had behaved badly, if we were to say that NATO had behaved badly, and I think we can say both, then we can also say that the response of dropping cluster bombs on primary schools is not the solution to that problem. And I think that we need to recognize that. And, I don't think that if we want to have a more balanced and moderate relationship between former Soviet countries and Russia, then the solution of Vladimir Putin, I think, is even worse than what the European Union and NATO has done.
The NATO countries, actually particularly the European members of NATO, are escalating this conflict by stuffing in huge amounts of NATO weaponry, including very advanced and high-tech weaponry, which may fall into, who knows, hands in the future. Why did they do that?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question. I do not want to escalate the situation. And of course, I said right from the outset of this interview that, I don't want the European Union to border Russia. But then again, I don't want the European Union to border anybody, because I believe that everybody should leave it. However, when you have somebody who's putting around stick, when you are having somebody bullying, when you're having somebody who's willing to carpet bomb Syrians, carpet bomb Chechens, and then drop barrel bombs on Ukrainians, you have to stand up to a bully like that. I just do not believe that if Russia has an outcome here, Vladimir Putin is the man that's pushing it forward by any stretch of the imagination. And I just don't think there's a moral equivalence. I don't think that you can say that just because the European Union has behaved badly. Hey, and by the way, you know, the European Union attempted to create a war in Ireland when we'd done so much to neutralize the issue of Irish republicanism and try to bring that community together. The minute Britain left the European Union attempted to create a war in Ireland. So I think we understand the European Union's poor behavior, but there is no moral equivalence that says that just because the European Union is empire building, you can barrel bomb hospitals, maternity units, and schools. I just don't believe that Vladimir Putin is the solution to any problem in the world.
You're on the Polish-Ukrainian border. I know you've not been there for long, but what's your impression of how the local people are seeing this conflict?
Well, I think there's a fair degree of terror here. I don't think people in Poland, particularly, and obviously I'm in Poland rather than Ukraine at the moment, I don't think the Polish people are particularly nervous about any sort of invasion of Poland. But of course, what has happened is there is a huge refugee crisis. And I just think that people are genuinely devastated that there will be war in Europe. You know, there is an element about Europeans, which I don't know whether you would call it racism, but certainly it's an uppityness where, you know, wars are something that happens somewhere else. Refugees are what happens to Afghans or people from the Middle East. It shouldn't happen in our continent. And I think that there's a great deal of shock and terror as a result of what's taken place.
It is typical, isn't it, Ella, that they think that wars are something that only happen elsewhere, that has its own loaded set of issues. But they seem to have forgotten Yugoslavia. They seem to have forgotten that NATO actually bombarded a European capital, Belgrade, just over 20 years ago.
Yeah, and of course he's a very strange friend to have, because he's accepting as gospel truth that the Russians have been bombing primary schools and maternity hospitals.
Not just bombing, the old barrel bomb has come back into the discourse. I haven't seen a barrel bomb.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, so, you know, part of our difficulty is that we are cut off from any source of news other than the official line. So we don't actually know what's really happening. So they can make any kind of lie about what Putin is doing. I mean, Putin would be idiotic to bomb maternity hospitals and primary schools. You know,
what would be the point militarily of doing so?
I mean, what he's interested in is having Ukraine neutral. He wants all the Ukrainians to be happy in Ukraine, but neutral. And bombing primary schools and maternity hospitals would be so stupid. Surely nobody thinks Putin is as stupid as that. I mean, he's a very clever person.
I've never known a time, have you, when we have been so cut off from alternative. I mean, and I go back some. Even in the Vietnam War, we had journalists striking a discordant note, particularly photographers and cameramen who were sending back images that were quite at odds with the anodyne political discourse of the politicians. But from this part of the world, the periphery, the 10%, it's really blanket wall to wall, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And they've completely forgotten the demands that Russia put just at the end of last year. We want a neutral Ukraine.
They've also forgotten the war didn't begin 16, 17 days ago.
No.
It began 8 years ago.
Absolutely.
With the Western overthrow of the elected government.
Absolutely.
The president running for his life, the parliament on fire, the MPs at gunpoint, forced to sign anti-Russian legislation, and so on. There'll be much more of this in the second half, so don't go away. watching this special edition of Kalibahara on Al Mayadeen as part of Al Mayadeen's deep and widely praised coverage and debate over the war in Ukraine. Now here's the thing. There's been political cross-dressing going on in the West for quite some time. Donald Trump, for example, campaigned on the platform that he would withdraw America from needless foreign wars. He said that the sand, he thinks it's all sand, in the Arab world was the most expensive sand in history. There's been a kind of blurring of the lines between left and right for some time, but it has reached its sharpest point over this war in Ukraine. Virtually all of the important voices that have been raised against NATO have been from the right, whilst the so-called left, actually they're liberals, but they are extremely numerous and are in control of most of the media and much of the political class. Let's call them the Tony Blair school of small L liberalism, have been gung-ho for war. They have been the ones demanding a no-fly zone. How did that happen, Keith Bennett?
Well, good question. And I mean, I think it's particularly disgusting to see somebody like Keir Starmer, who's actually positioning himself to be more bellicose and more warlike than the Tory government. And we have a situation where, 11 Labour MPs were prepared to put their names to a stop the war statement, a statement which incidentally began by denouncing the Russians for their actions in Ukraine.
And then they quickly removed their names. But it's true in the US also, isn't it? Because this is another Democratic Party war.
Well, aren't they all?
The most egregious of them, yes.
I mean, Vietnam was a Democrat Party war. Korea was a Democrat Party war. But also in the left, if I can call them that, the imperialist countries, are we still allowed to use terms like that?
On Kalimohora, it's free word. You can say anything you like.
But in the imperialist countries, this has a long history. I mean, just a few months before the outbreak of war in the summer of 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, the socialist parties from every country got together and agreed a common position that in the event of war breaking out, they would take their main enemy as being at home and they would fight against their own ruling class. When the war actually broke out, there was Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, and there was a handful of others, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany, a prominent leader in Austria, I think it's Adler from memory, John McClain in our part of the world, James Connolly in our nearest neighbour, and that was about it. So these people were extremely isolated, but they were proved correct. And we saw it again, 10 years ago in the war on Libya. There were sections of the far left in Europe, some of them, I might say, who were pleased to take Gaddafi's money at times, were lining up for the NATO war that destroyed the most prosperous country in Africa and turned it from a developing country along broadly socialist lines into a country where black people are literally sold as slaves in markets. And the thing is, they don't learn, they just get worse and worse.
Are we in mental health territory here, Mark? I mean, is it psychological? I mean, how can people who have made a career telling us how left-wing they are be in the NATO camp urging greater warlike efforts by NATO?
Well, I'm proud to be the author of a book about a fine parliamentarian of colour called Shapoorji Saklatvala. And he not only would have kept his name on that Stop the War statement, but probably would have wanted to toughen it in terms of its criticism of imperialism as an Indian and as a communist. And that's what's lacking. We've not just got clientist journalism, we've got clientist politics based in Parliament. and the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs, more than 30 of them. They were your comrades and colleagues
Once.
back in the day when you were in Parliament. And where's their voice been raised against what's going on? Where's their analysis been? It's been completely lacking. And I think it's a political bankruptcy here that we're looking at.
Let's go to Russia, it's only fair, to Moscow, to Nikolai Gorshkov, former director and editor at Sputnik News, and now an independent journalist. Nikolai.
Okay.
How do you assess the damage to Russia, to Europe, and even the United States as a result of this conflict?
Well, the damage is a double-edged sword. Of course, Russia is suffering, will probably suffer more because of all the sanctions imposed on her. But the counter-sanctions imposed by Russia would hurt the West as well. It's a no-win-win situation. Nobody's going to win. There might be hopes in the West that the West would persevere and prevail, but it's unlikely. First of all, the West is still being probably a dominant economic factor in the world. Still, it's not the only factor. There is China, there is India, there's Iran, there's Africa, there's Latin America. So the West is basically a small part of the world, of course, with huge potential, with a huge market and a lot of disposable income. But probably, and the Russians are saying this right now, probably it's the best opportunity the world has ever had since the collapse of the Soviet Union for a restructuring of the world's economy, so that more countries will come to the fore, and more countries will have freedom for their economies and for their trade, as opposed to right now when everybody is basically is dependent on the US market and the US dollar and the goodwill of the Federal Reserve System and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
You're in Moscow. How are the people coping with this crisis? How many agree? How many disagree?
Well, obviously, there is a split in the Russian public opinion. I'd say that a minority of people who, would be usually called as the chattering classes, the so-called intelligentsia or the liberal class, they, of course, are not happy. Some people have already left the country. Others have spoken against this military operation. Others are complaining about lack of Parmesan cheese, or other Western goodies, although still they are available. But of course, the sanctions are not something new. The sanctions had been introduced back in a lot of them in 2014, but even before that, there were certain restrictions. But the majority of people, they're used to being in some kind of isolation or feeling like being a besieged fortress from their previous experiences, or simply not understanding why the West is doing to us because we haven't done anything different from the West, when the West thought it was appropriate to protect the people, say, of Bosnia or of Kosovo or anywhere else. They would go in with a lot of bombers, and rocket fire and shelling and everything would be fine from a Western point of view. Now we are trying to save our brothers across the border in Ukraine, and all of a sudden the West is against this. They're actually helping those who had been abusing the people in Donbass, for example. So basically the general mood for now is that it'll end up soon. Let us finish our job in Ukraine.
Did you anticipate this level of escalation, both by Russia and by NATO in response?
Well, to a Russian, didn't come as a surprise, because for a Russian, they all knew what was going on for 8 years since 2014 in East Ukraine. They knew there was civil strife. They knew that the new Ukrainian state after the coup in February 2014, they came down like a ton of bricks on the people in the East. if Russia ever interfered in that conflict back in 2014, it was because Russia felt responsible for protecting people in East Ukraine against the aggression by the state from Kiev. That was the issue. It was not very much different from what the West was accusing Belgrade of in Kosovo. When Kosovars started protesting, Serbian police started trying to put it down. And of course, Serbian police was blamed for all the brutality. And then Belgrade was bombed for what, 78 days. So we're in early days in Ukraine right now. But if NATO followed their own logic from Kosovo, they should be bombing Kiev right now.
Do you think we're headed into a Cold War even colder than the last one?
Well, God forbid we're heading towards a hot war, a bigger hot war. I'm not entirely optimistic, because you have to understand, when President Putin says that we and the Ukrainians are one people, you may also interpret this as the Ukrainians are as hardy fighters as we are. So in a way, in a lot of people's minds, this is not really a war between Russia and Ukraine. In a way, it's a fratricidal war. It is a civil war.
What do you say to those that theorize that this has all been a trap for Russia and that Putin has fallen into it, and that the European Union and the NATO countries, never particularly united these last years, are now united as never before?
Well, the general line of thinking in Russia is that, yes, it was provoked by the West, but not necessarily because they wanted to reintegrate or reunite. The understanding is that the real big target for the West, especially for the United States, is China. Now, if China, in its future conflict, a lot of people believe is inevitable with the United States, if China has a backup in the face of Russia's energy, Russia's military power or whatever, because the first thing the United States would do if there's a conflict between them and China, they would cut off Chinese maritime supply routes. So the only supply route to China, if there is a conflict with the United States, would be from Siberia. Hence, the power of Siberia gas pipeline, for example. There are oil pipelines as well. They are not being used right now, but a lot of people suspect these pipelines had been built, actually, in the case of a major war between China and the United States. So the people are thinking that if Russia is undermined and weakened, China would be next. And when they hear, for example, that some Chinese companies are following or abiding by the sanctions, and there are some Chinese companies who are abiding by Western sanctions, people in Russia are saying, this is not clever, because once they get rid of us, they would go after China. So China must be aware of that.
The corollary of that, though, Ella, is that if Russia prevails and Ukraine is at least neutralized, demilitarized, then the power of this Russia-China strategic partnership will become an even more important lodestar in world affairs. So China has a big stake in Russia prevailing, not just for the reason that was mentioned there, but for other reasons too. Financial, for example. If you end the hegemony of the dollar and the SWIFT system, then you automatically increase the importance of the Chinese alternatives.
No, absolutely. And you end the ability of the United States to stifle people with sanctions, because you can offer an alternative. I mean, what's not to like? I'm sure that the Chinese realize that their future lies in close alliance with Russia. I'm positive of it.
It is quite a turn of events for those of us old enough to have lived through the Sino-Soviet split. For someone like me, this is very heaven. that China and Russia should be the closest of allies. Indeed, as President Xi said, more than allies. How's that going to change the world?
Well, very heaven, as you say, alas, we're not young anymore, to finish the quote.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that if one looks at this situation, I think our friend in Moscow was, absolutely right about the importance to China of that source of oil and natural gas from Russia, from Siberia, also from Turkmenistan. That's also very important. But just a few weeks ago, President Putin was in Beijing. He was there for the opening of the Winter Olympics. But very importantly, President Putin and President Xi Jinping issued a joint statement of 5,300 words, which is, very I think it's pretty much unprecedented in Chinese diplomacy. I can't speak about Russian to that extent, but where they really set out what's essentially a manifesto for a non-imperialist world order, and this is something that came about in the last few weeks. And if you look at that last 50 or so years of international relations that you alluded to, whether it was from the Republican side in the US, fronted by Kissinger, or the Democrat side, fronted by Brzezinski, their overwhelming goal was to ensure that the Soviet Union as it was and China should remain as divided as possible, so that the United States could essentially play both sides against the middle. But for about the last 10 years, I'd say, since Hillary Clinton, particularly since Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama, the West has seemed to do everything in its power to drive Russia and China together, which, I think will be seen, luckily, as a monumental failure of foreign policy. They seem to want Russia and China and Iran and others to join as close together as possible, because I think they were, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were drunk with success.
Drunk with arrogance and power.
But also, I think because they thought that they'd crush Russia. I mean, Bloomberg did an article recently where it said that in the space of 2 weeks, Russia leapfrogged North Korea and Iran to be the most sanctioned country on earth. Most sanctioned by North America and Europe, and I mean the only places in Asia that have joined in those sanctions, and the list speaks for itself: Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. Nobody else in Asia is putting any sanctions. But this package of unprecedented sanctions by so many countries, this plan was not worked out in a day. They've been waiting for their opportunity.
And of course, every action has a reaction. When McDonald's pulled out of Russia, Russia nationalized its property and has made huge sums available for people to develop a new fast food industry in Russia, hopefully a more healthy one.
Yeah.
In fact, by sanctioning Russia by withdrawing Pornhub, CNN, Coca-Cola and McDonald's, they may have done the Russian people quite a favor. The V word, the I word, has just emerged. Iran will be out of sanctions in days. Yeah. The JCPOA has been put back together. Having declared President Maduro an outlaw in Venezuela and given someone else his job, to whom they gave $1 billion worth of gold from the Bank of England, what happened to Juan Guaido? Now the Americans are in Caracas begging President Maduro to up the oil output and lifting some sanctions to enable him to do so.
I think we should build on your theme of the unexpected consequence of this aggression by NATO, the imperialists, the Americans, of a Eurasian alliance that's come out of this. I mean, I'm helping with other black activists and trade unionists to build a new anti-racist European organization called the Liberation Movement. And you've supported that from the get-go. And we were in Chinatown on a demonstration against anti-Asian hatred. And, you know, during the pandemic, we saw the attacks on Chinese people, people who looked Chinese, they were attacked.
My own wife, who's not Chinese but looks it.
That's right. So you saw what happened there. And now you're seeing a wave of anti-Russian hatred. You know, organizations, restaurants that have Russia in their name, Russian restaurant, have had to take it down. You know, just absolutely irrational behavior going on. You mentioned football stadia, where you see all these yellow and blue flags and, you know, whatnot.
It's obligatory, obligatory.
But, you know, as a journalist, let me raise a question. You talked about George Orwell before, where the Ministry of War becomes the Ministry of Peace or the Ministry of Defence. What about this word radical? They're calling the neo-Nazis that do exist, in fact there's a battalion of them in the Ukraine, they're calling them radicals. They're not calling them neo-Nazis or Nazis. So language has been twisted to disguise some of the horrors that have gone on, including in the Donbass, you know, the two republics that have a Russian...
For 8 years.
That's right.
Both of my grandfathers in the same regiment fought in the same army, in the same two principal battles, the Battle of El Alamein and the Battle of Monte Cassino, against Nazis, against fascism. They didn't know each other, but they were in the same regiment. And their son and daughter married each other, and that's why I'm here. We've reached a stage now where the British and American governments and the Western media are in full support, full flight support for an ultra-nationalist government in Kiev and its armed forces, a significant part of which is Nazi. And when you show people their swastika flags and their SS insignia and their Hitler salutes and their adoration for a man responsible for the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Polish and Ukrainian people, many of them Jews, many of them murdered before the SS even got there to murder them. That man's name is Stepan Bandera. He is the idol of modern Ukraine. He was a Nazi collaborator with the blood of hundreds of thousands of people on his hands. There's a major avenue in downtown Kiev. It's called Stepan Bandera Avenue. And on it sits the IKEA store. The founder of IKEA
Nazi.
was a Swedish Nazi. It's perfect symmetry. Well, for me, and I think all of my friends here, not necessarily Andrei out there in Poland, but my friends in the studio, we will not stand with Nazis. My grandfathers and everyone else's fathers and grandfathers had the right idea. We fight Nazis and we try our best to destroy them. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalimahora on Al Mayadeen Television. Thank you for watching.